Hey friend, I have a quick message for you before today's episode. Let me ask you, are you having a hard time getting your team motivated? Do they feel disengaged? And of course, as you know, you are not alone. There's many people like you facing the same problems every day. What if I told you that you can motivate your team without even trying? Well, Karin, the guest on this episode, will host an online workshop for you that tackles engagement without focusing on motivation. You can see the details at bit.ly/Karin with a K, that's KARIN_SMTP. And the link is also on the show notes. Now, I can already hear you say, what do you mean without focusing on motivation? That's a great question. One of the main reasons Agile fails or doesn't achieve the outcomes we want is because we're trying to install Agile like if it were an app on top of an outdated operating system. It's like trying to install a 3D game on top of Windows 95. The operating system on which we are trying to install Agile is the underlying management and leadership paradigm that the associated mindset that we are really blind to, that even I and maybe you are blind to. In this workshop, Karin explores a different leadership mindset and gives us the tools and exercises that will help us adopt this new operating system of sorts and overcome the need to motivate, which is really an old leadership paradigm focus, by replacing that need with a new approach, self-organization as it was meant to be. For more on that, visit bit.ly/Karin_SMTP. The link is also on the show notes. So if your vision is to develop a team or organization with highly motivated, self-driven, and responsible team members, we look forward to seeing you in this workshop and introducing a way of seeing leadership that will help you develop successful teams. You can get the details at bit.ly/Karin_SMTP. That was the announcement. Now on to the episode. Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode this week with a guest that has been here on the podcast before, Karin Tenelius. Hi, Karin. Welcome back.
Yeah, hello. Hi.
So Karin is just recently written a book, or published rather, because the book has been written for a long time, but published a book called Moose Heads on the Table, Stories about Self-Managing Organizations from Sweden. And you can get the book on Amazon and other outlets. The link will be on the show notes. Karin has actually been working with self-organization as a way to help teams improve performance even before Scrum was in the picture. I actually met Karin the first time in 2018 and got really interested in her stories and the book. And today Karin is somewhere, I guess, in countryside Sweden, enjoying the wonderful fall we have here in this northern latitudes. And we catch up to talk about some self-organization stories that can help us as Scrum Masters. So Karin, first question, your book is called Moose Heads on the Table. Obviously Moose Heads because you're from Sweden, but that has a meaning. It's quite a curious name. Why did you decide to title the book with that peculiar title?
Yeah, it took some time to name the book, but we ended up in that title because my biggest finding, having worked with self-management for this long time and different contexts and cases, is that it's crucial to have a working climate, an atmosphere, culture of trust, straightforward communication, and psychological safety, one can say. Otherwise, it won't work. So very common to put structures in at first and then forget about the soft thing. And a tool to shift a culture from one that is not that quality from the beginning. It could be, could be a bad working climate, or it could be lacking of feedback culture, for instance, then a tool is moose heads on the table, which actually comes from the elephant in the room, which I think is a saying from the States or so that everybody knows now. But when we started this, that saying was not so well known in Sweden, although we heard it and thought it was a very good metaphor. So we changed it to moosehead. And the metaphor is that a group of people sits around a table and plan their business plans or budget or whatever. And there's something in the air that stops and hinders the conversation to be really creative and dynamic. That could be something that is infected or taboo to talk about. And it is like it is a moose head lying on the table and nobody talks about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a very easy metaphor to use. And when people have got that metaphor, you can ask them, what are your moose heads in this group? So that's where it comes from.
Indeed. And I'm sure that over the years, you kind of developed maybe a sixth sense to figuring out that there are some moose heads on the table. So from your experience, what are some hints, some things we could look at as Scrum Masters that would help us to start to detect that there are some moose heads here that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, so you can develop a sense of the air, and all of us more or less can sense that, but we don't pay attention to it. We sort of ignore it. And it could be when people are very hesitant and it's silent and it's cautious, or it's some dynamic between people in the group. It's something that's going on underneath the surface. It's not the surface issues like we talk about the budget or the programming or whatever we talk about, but there's something in the group that's going on. And to develop a sense of hearing and feeling and experience that is the first thing, to take it seriously, sort of, and understand that it impacts the result. And what you can do with it is to bring it up. So I have a feeling that we are really sort of cautious in this group. What if that is the feeling? What does that stand for? Or do you share this experience? Or what are your take? Do you think I am right in this? Or I think we could be more brave when we talk to each other or something. So you start to address it. And through addressing it, you can shift it.
Absolutely. So at least in my own experience, when we start to address that, there might be a little bit of discomfort. So we might want to, at least what I usually do is, I get the feeling that we are not all at ease speaking about the release that is delayed.
Mm.
Is that correct? Am I getting the right feeling? Like kind of just almost like mirroring, but at the same time showing that, you might be wrong and people might not yet be ready to talk about it. So don't try to push it too hard. What do you think about that?
Well, so moose heads are more people-related issues. Like if you're late, and if that's a pattern, for instance, it's the sort of reasons or why are we late? Somebody's always delaying it by this person's tendency to be over ambitious, or so it's something around the facts, the surface issue that is too delicate to bring up. Like, I don't trust you to be, in time of your deliverance, and I have this hesitancy of bringing it up because I know you get upset if I sort of talk about it. So it's those kind of things, tendencies that we people have, like we have strengths, but we have also pitfalls. And those tendencies are always the root, the source of poor results, sort of. And that is what we need. Or I don't have trust in you because you say something and that doesn't happen. And to be able to bring up that, you also have to not be judgmental. So part of this is also to take out right and wrong from the conversation. And you do that by saying to a group, I'm not interested in finding scapegoats or and see who is wrong here, or I'm interested in workability, what works. So you take out right and wrong concept, and you speak from what is working, and not criticizing, just empower people or help the thing to work, sort of. So you create the context of talking about delicate things in the context of not blaming or criticizing.
Yeah, exactly. Because the moment people even smell blame or criticism, they will definitely, run for the hills and, as it were, cross their arms and lean back and not interact.
Yeah, or start to argue
defensively. Yeah. So talking about issues, delicate issues without blame or without recrimination is one of the aspects of starting to work with that self-organization you actually talk about in the book. Now, there's a lot of good stories in the book, but of course, one should leave some of the best stories for people to go and find them in the book that you can get on Amazon, and the link is on the show notes. But share one story, Karin, that is particularly illustrative of the approach that you guys at, is it TUF Leadership?
Yeah, TUF Leadership Training. Yeah.
That you guys use and also help your clients use.
Yeah, I can take one early example, because the first experience was in a group where there were no, it was quite a good working climate. It was trust and good communication. But the second one, where I was the CEO in a training company with 14 people, and they had suffered for 7 years of loss in that company. It was a rich owner that put in money all the time. And there I learned that it was so important that it was a good atmosphere and a good culture. And where I had what it was, there was a lot of mooseheads. One moosehead was that people, they also had like a row of CEOs there that sort of came in and ended. And the last CEO also had sort of fired people without telling the group about that. So people just disappeared. So it was like, and nobody talked about it. So that, of course, created a lot of uncertainty and speculations and myths even. So there was a lot of myths and a lot of distrust, very much distrust in this group. So there I had to sort of install to talk about the mooseheads and by that increase the level of trust and open communication. The other thing was that in this small company with just 14 people, it was no transparency. So people didn't know how the company was doing or the business, which was, weird in such a small company. So here we gave all the information out about the losses, and people went from hoping things would be better to regarding them as agents for creating the shift and do the company successful. So they saw themselves as mental owners of the whole thing, not sitting waiting for some new CEO to come in and rescue them. And of course, then the mandate. So I gave away the mandate totally. I wasn't operational. I listened to their solutions, asked questions to clarify, and endorsed their things. If there was not something that worried me so much that I had to say, "Oh, can you please explain your idea?" But because this makes me worried, because I was this formal CEO, so I had to take responsibility for the figures. But I realized I never had to interfere with their solutions. And of course, when they created the solutions, they already were on board on the solutions. So they sort of made them happen very quickly in this little organization.
So I have a question about that, because what you describe, especially the last part of kind of opening up the mandate for people themselves to take ownership of what they would be working on.
Yes.
I have a specific question about that very often we as Scrum Masters and many Scrum Masters have been in the past either team leaders or project managers, or they have had some leadership position in the groups that they were in. That's typically how we end up being Scrum Masters. But we also have to fight that internal doubt. Like, can this team really be responsible and own their decisions? And I think that's kind of a personal transformation that we need to go through. So in your mind, Karin, like what are the steps you went through to actually go from, I think it's a good idea to have the team define what they do, to actually knowing it was a good idea?
Yeah. So I was totally scared, a lot of times there, because I sort of had given my word to make this company break even, which was like a pipe dream by then. So of course I was worrying, and especially when we were in bad situations and it didn't look like it was on track. So I really can relate to that lack of believing that those were capable enough, and my sort of tendency to go and rescue them and make things work. But the thing you can have is that distrust or that doubt you have, you can regard that as a moosehead and say, honestly, I'm worried. I'm worried for this to work. I really want to relate to you as capable. And having that conversation, people will sort of speak to that. And that will give you also feedback on how much power there are there. And if you are more worried after bringing up that, you can also give them feedback. So I'm even more worried now, because what I see is a mindset that you're lacking something that I really want to see, sort of. So it's like, that's your weapon of always being able to talk about your fear, your doubt. And by that, people will either say something that sort of shifts that or sort of acknowledge that. And then the team in itself can see, we really sort of lack drive here. How should we deal with that lack of drive?
So it's also kind of helping the team realize their potentially their blind spots or even their lack of willingness to take ownership, because that also happens sometimes.
Exactly. And it could be distinguishing a lack of competence in certain areas. Sort of, honestly, we don't have that competency, these skills, or what should we do with that? Shall we teach ourselves, or should we bring somebody in? Or so it's like, I used to say that those processes reveals everything that doesn't work, but it's not you that has to think on nighttime, I wonder if they will manage, or I wonder if this will work. You put it out in the open for them to deal with. And then you release capacity and wisdom. Especially you release people that don't say so much, like invisible capacity that's not sort of shown or so you will have much more a picture of what's there and what's missing.
Absolutely. Then another aspect, of course, is which is also one of the most common objections that I hear about self-organization. So I live in Finland, and maybe, Karin, you are a little bit familiar with the Finnish culture. It's quite different from the Swedish culture when it comes to work. And there's this preference for having strong leaders, and the leader is always right. And of course, the most common objection, I'm sure many of our listeners have heard that too, is that self-organization is chaos. I'm sure you've heard this before. So how do you tackle that objection?
Yeah, I've heard that about 1 million times. And it's more and more peculiar, because when I see organizations on the other side of installing self-organization, I see very solid structures, because the people in the organizations creates systems where stuff don't fall between the chairs or get missed, or they create their own system for following up the results. So it's much more order, not risk of missing out stuff in those organizations. And it's much more lean and agile and sort of not so much energy spent on stuff that is unnecessary. So the thing people hear that everyone can do whatever they like, which is not true. People hear that you don't have to take in consideration like frameworks and rules and structures. They think that all is letting loose and free, which is not true. And they can't sort of picture some organizations that it's more organic, team-based, network based, because they are so familiar with the squares, and the squares create some safety or certainty, which is also when we see before and after that the old system was quite fraud and quite fragile, but those squares is an illusion of order.
And by squares, you mean like these predefined processes and clear role distinctions and...
Yeah. And one more thing, in all self-managing organization, there are a lot of clarity that is created by the people. So clarity in what am I responsible for, what am I accountable for, what is the purpose or the function of this little team or myself. So it's a lot of clarity in those, which is not at all chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's perhaps even clarity on things that we are not very used to in the normal corporate world. So in one of the chapters, the Elizabeth Gordon chapter, you talk about what, at least, in my own professional career, I've always been taught is a taboo, which is sharing information on everybody's salaries. And yet in your story, that's actually one of the steps in the self-organization journey. So tell us that story and how it became, the sharing people's information on salaries, how it became a boost to self-organization.
Yes. And also I recommend not to start with that day one, because you have to have a mature communication level where people are adult, and it needs to be working climate before you start to discuss money. But what we learned is that it takes a lot of energy to speculate on salaries, because at least here in Sweden and in the Nordic country, we don't talk about what we earn. It's a secret. And there is a lot of energy that is used for speculating in if I am having the right salary compared to my colleague, etc. So that energy can be used to other stuff. And when it's open, sometimes it's a lot of anger, because usual salary setting is so irrational and it's so dependent on friendship, relationship, and all sorts of human factors, and not at all logical sometimes. So having it loose, it becomes more fair, because the people decide on what basis or criteria you should build the salaries on. And in Elizabeth Gordon, they did a tariff based on experience, a number of years in education, higher education, a number of years in the business. That was sort of the criteria for setting. And then they ended up in a very simple table. So when then they did the recruitment, they just said to the candidates, this is what we pay, so it also reformed and did the recruitment process very efficient.
Yeah, because then of course, salaries are one of the most important aspects, and you kind of weed out the candidates that are looking for high salaries and not perhaps so much responsibility.
Exactly. And also, if you're going to take responsibility for the finance aspects of a business, it would be weird not to know about it.
Yeah. And also, I think that what you just said, that a team, or in this case, a business, the workers in a business cannot take ownership of the financial stability of the business if at the same time they are hidden from one of the most important decisions in any business, which is the salary burden on the business.
Exactly. Yes. And it's also, you think that people will be very greedy, but I don't see that. Fairness is what they want. Fairness and understanding the criteria And that's what people want.
Absolutely. So over the years, you've collected and developed your approach into a set of ideas and practices and actually a training program. So walk us through the most important aspects of the TÜV leadership training program.
Yeah. So, of course, the former managers, or if you decide to keep managers, which many do, the managers need to shift mindset a lot. And that's really a challenge, because in the Nordic countries, at least in Sweden, managers think that they are coaching and involving because they have been taught that in theory for 30 years. And because they know it in theory, they think like they act like that. But it's a very big distance between theory and practice here. So all managers are acting in a way which I call a hierarchical dynamic, and it resembles the relationship between a child and a parent. And it's not like they treat, employees or team members as child or children, but the dynamic is that the manager has so much responsibility for the kids or the employees to be happy, for instance, and that they are blind to. So you have to sort of take out the blindness and make them see how stuck they are in a parent-child paradigm. So that's what we do in the TÜV training. So we start with confronting this stuckness to be able to unlearn and stop doing a lot of stuff they do, talk a lot.
What might be some of those examples that show that, from the manager's perspective, they might think I am not acting like that. But when you actually start to look at it from the outside, it starts to become obvious why it really is this parent-child relationship.
Yeah. So all managers in the world, they long for responsible and motivated employees and teams. So the first thing they need to get is that how they are relating to the teams determines how much engagement and responsibility is there. So it's they who have to see that and confront that and change. And then stopping to talk so much, stopping to think all the solutions up and have agendas all the time. So one thing is to think together with the team, not having thought ahead, sort of like put the problem in the group. And this they know in theory, they have read all the books, but to do that in practice. And that requires a whole different mindset to trust that, as you said, not doubting, just doubting and do it yourself or think all the solutions up. And it also requires a whole new level of listening, because managers are not taught or trained to listen. They're taught to talk. And there's so much efficiency in listening, especially nowadays when we have so well-educated people and, people that really want to step in.
So for me, this is actually a very good thread that I would like to explore a little bit more, because the way I look at it is that what you just said applies to managers, like you said, but it also applies to Scrum Masters. I mean, the immediate conclusion that I can take from this is that sometimes we as Scrum Masters, when we don't see the teams acting in the way we wish, we might start by first looking at how we are acting around the team, rather than start to project onto the team the responsibility over their actions, because we are part of the system. The way we behave when we are with the team affects how a team behaves with us.
Exactly. And that is not the Scrum Master's fault. It's the paradigm that makes them do this. So we say at TÜV that it's like upgrading your operating system, because you're sort of automatic in your way of dealing with the group or the people or the problems. And you have to find a whole different way of relating that feels really uncomfortable in the beginning, because it's much more stepping back and listen to what's out there instead of emptying your thoughts all the time. So it's very sort of inconvenient and uncomfortable, and people say this is not leadership because they don't recognize it as such. But it's traditional leadership that is not working so great anymore. And agile is an answer to that.
I would go even further, at least in my experience. I would say that it has actually never worked for any complex problem. And I was just thinking, like, for example, this is a very simple example. One of the things that most Scrum Masters do, and that in itself is not wrong in any way, is to prepare the facilitation for a retrospective. But very few Scrum Masters come to the retrospective with just the intention of helping the team figure out how they want to facilitate it. And that in itself is some sort of preparation, but it is a preparation for helping the teams take ownership of that space, which is the retrospective, rather than us serving as kind of the proxy for it, right?
Yes, spot on. So replace your plans and your instructions with questions. So how do you want to do this? How do we do the retrospective in the best way? And then just questions are what you do.
Questions are what you do. I think that's a brilliant tip and a brilliant quote for sure.
Yeah. And also, when you are getting better at listening, then you will be much more masterful in posing the right questions, the questions that move things forward. Because in the beginning, when you ask questions, you just take the questions out of your head, and then they're not so powerful. But when you can listen what's happening out there in the group, then you can ask the questions relevant to what's actually happening.
Absolutely. And that is something we need to practice as Scrum Masters for sure, not just managers, but we as Scrum Masters too.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, Scrum Masters, managers, teachers in a class, doctors with a patient, it's the same thing. It's relevant whenever you want to empower somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Karin, it's been a pleasure. We're getting close to the end, so unfortunately, but where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, we have a webpage called toughleadershiptraining.com. There you find everything.
Absolutely. We'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily find that page. Karin, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.